By now, I'm sure we're all sick and tired of mass immigration. It's eroding the country that we've always known, replacing the native populations of the West, and making it increasingly harder and harder for us to access social services and compete on the job market. Now, commonly, we all try and think of the reason for this as it has to have been some kind of sinister, evil person doing this to us. It's part of some kind of evil plot maligned by some special interest group to try and, punish us for whatever reason. I don't want to go down the conspiratorial rabbit hole, and in fact, this video here is to kind of debunk that in a way. The main reason we are having mass immigration is primarily because of economic interests coming from the very top economic elites all the way down to local business owners. Think your local hotel managers or retail owners.
I want you
Simply
to.
put, immigration is a wage suppression tool. It disrupts competition within unions to try and better wages and just makes the labor pool cheaper and cheaper. You have to firmly reassess your attribution to what is causing this towards the economic magnet. And we're going to lay out today the reasons for this.
I want you to quickly imagine two types of people. You got Andy, you got Samantha. Andy is an American immigrant, and he came from all the way from China. He worked incredibly hard to get into Harvard, and then once he was in Harvard, he worked incredibly hard, and by the time he was 20, he'd already had 2 startups. Now he's 25, he's married with Samantha, and he's on his 3rd startup that is making millions and millions and millions of dollars. Now, Andy believes that people in America aren't very hardworking. He believes they're entitled and lazy. And so for him to get the workers he wants to get, which tend to be from East Asia or Eastern Europe, he has these schemes that bring them up into these high-level universities, and then they end up working for him as postgraduates. Now, Samantha, on the other hand, she and her daddy worked in law firms, right? They were able to get top positions in corporate law firms, and to her benefit, the people that she works with, her assistants and all of that, are cheaper if she brings them from abroad. Why? Because they're willing to settle for a smaller wage, a less wage, and be able to work harder, right? And so what they end up doing, this couple, who are, by the way, multi-millionaires, what they end up doing is creating this little foundation. They call it the, Andy Samantha Foundation, very original name. And what they end up doing is creating these schemes to bring up graduates and undergraduates, into American universities, and also train them to be able to work for them. Now, fundamentally, these guys are fueling immigration. Maybe they're not fueling it by the thousands, but it befits them. It works for them. The system that they built with these kind of institutions is there to benefit their self-interests, not the interests of the nation. Bear in mind, although Samantha is a born American in this case, Andy is not. So he doesn't have much attachment to the land. And Samantha primarily is disconnected from the land herself, thinking more so about her elite status than anything else. But anyway, Christian bro, on to the next slide. I just want you to bear in mind those two people as we continue the points that we're going to make today.
It will thread through naturally. Now, the thing we want to first discuss is the fact that immigration is certainly, and by no means disputable, a right-wing issue. This goes for any great country in the West. Essentially, it just splits into 2 paradigms. If you're left-wing, let them all in, that sort of thing. If you're right-wing, it ranges from, deporting all of them to light, cucked measures to stop, like, a couple coming in. But basically, the consensus is it's a right-wing, left-wing issue. Now, actually, traditionally, this has not been the case. Going back, if you look a couple of years, the left-wing movements were actually the ones most firmly opposed to immigration. And that logic of why they were opposed to immigration is fundamentally what we want to get to the root of today. Because if you look at it simply, what were old left-wing movements before they got co-opted into being, advocating for all sorts of woke stuff? They were about workers' rights and improving the living conditions of the average working class person within the country. And to do that, you have to have a strong working base that is in scarcity. If you have a large labor pool, there's far more competition, which naturally drives wages down. If you have a small, scarce labor pool, wages increase. It's a very basic economic logic. And that's why there's always been opposition, traditionally, from left-wing groups towards immigrants coming into the country to work. Because if you have an influx of people willing to work for cheaper labor, what happens is it degrades the wages paid to the native population. It's a very simple thing. Now, as it stands, that is not an issue, despite the left still holding on to a lot of socialist values, a lot of desire to see minimum wage increases and better working conditions. They I'm getting my words muddled up here. They consistently advocate for the influx of more and more migrants, only on humanitarian grounds, despite the fact that this raises the possibility of any of their economic ideas ever actually getting put in place. Now, for the right, of course, we tend to, and I say that as we, because broadly we would be on the right on this channel, we broadly recognize more the social consequences of immigration as our main opposition to it, ignoring, of course, the economic factor. You see, we've made a lot of videos before, talking about how free marketism is essentially just liberalism. But the marrying of the right to free market economics basically just ensures that we too end up advocating for immigrants, just in the sense that we're doing this to support business growth. Because growth in a population where there is a declined birth rate can only be sustained with importing more and more people. So fundamentally, what you have now is this kind of weird paradox where you have both the left and the right explicitly and implicitly both actually advocating for immigration, one socially, one economically, despite both of these absolutely ruining their prescribed economic or social aspirations. A very, very crazy situation.
Yeah, I agree, Christian, bro. And if we go on to the next slide, the example I wanted to give here is that oftentimes, whether it be by the media or by our politicians, these people tend to be seen as, well, uninvited pests. They're not welcomed in, with borders being in place as well. However, if you were to look below the surface, below these images that make them seem unwelcomed, these people are being brought in. They are being pushed in. No matter how many times we talk about enhancing border control or being stricter on who we let in and who we don't, what ends up happening is that we get more immigrants. And it's not serving us, it's not serving you, it's not serving me. Who is it really serving? Well, we know it's serving the economic elites. And at the end of the day, whether you see it from an angle of lobbying, with the politicians' pockets being lined up with millionaire and billionaire donors' money, at the end of the day, the politicians don't particularly care about this issue because, well, it doesn't really affect them. What Peter Turchin calls a wealth pump continuously happens. And what a wealth pump is that the richer get richer, to put it in simple words. If you imagine a bell curve, the income at the end has another little bump. Okay? So what ends up happening is that you have a big bell curve, but then to the right-hand side, the upper quartiles, you have another bump, meaning the rich are actually getting continuously richer. But what then happens to the median income is that it continues dropping. What this means, as Christian Bro mentioned earlier, is that labor becomes cheaper to hire. Not only that, but the level in which you can maintain labor becomes cheaper. What I mean by that is people have lower standards of healthcare. This is in the States, for example. Or in here, people have lower standards of working conditions. A very common example I remember hearing from one of my Polish friends is that whenever somebody he knows who comes from Poland, he asks him, where's his passport? That's the first question he asks. And the second the person says, well, my boss has it, well, you get the idea. He knows that he's here for economic reasons, he's being exploited, and this guy doesn't even know what wages are fair in the UK. But again, I'm not trying to make this guy, the Polish guy in this example, seem bad or anything, but he simply does not care. He's still in a better position than he was back home. The end point that I'm trying to make very quickly in this regard is that you see this image and you think, damn, they're sneaking in these little rats. But it's not just these people that are sneaking in. They're constantly being invited in. And instead of turning your attention towards the left side of politics and going, they're inviting them in, they're trying to protect their human rights, you should instead look at, well, who is truly benefiting from this? Because let's be real, you might have the, LGBTQ marcher in the street going, yeah, I'm pro-immigration, like this guy right here. However, he's not benefiting. And before I let you continue talking as well, Christian bro, in this case, we need to look at work and the market itself as a zero-sum game. These immigrants don't create jobs. And in fact, if they do start businesses, the markets tend to get flooded. And so imagine you're in a local population of 90,000, right? You have 10, 15 quite big businesses in this area. Maybe you have a local law firm that's been around for 3 generations. You have your supermarkets, right? 3 or 4, one of them being a quite large corporation. And then you also have your mom and pop stores, whether it be for clothes or whatever. Now imagine you have somebody else coming in from, I don't know, let's say it's in America and he comes from Venezuela or Mexico. He now opens up his own quote-unquote mom and pop store and, I don't know, he sells crisps and snacks and whatever. All of a sudden, the market itself stays at 90,000. However, it might increase slightly, but the demand hasn't increased for these stores. And because it's a zero-sum game, the resources are limited. Somebody wins and somebody loses. And at the end of the day, the person who wins is the person who's willing to get paid less, and work for more. And at the end of the day, the reality is most local populations aren't willing to degrade themselves in that way. Why? Because they saw their fathers, their grandparents work very hard to get a wage that was worth it. And they saw them work hard and be rewarded for it. But now they know that if they did work hard, they would still be rewarded minimum wage. Or even sometimes, if we look at it from a median perspective, it's still less than, inflation. And it's still worse off for them because they will never be able to own a house, for example. Again, this was one of the big milestones that got achieved in the 60s and 70s in America, whereas in the 80s and 90s, it became incredibly difficult. Imagine seeing your parents own a house or your grandparents own a house from working as a milkman or working as an assistant for quite a large corporation. But all of a sudden, you can barely afford a house and you have to juggle these two jobs and you can barely get out of having a savings rut. Any point you want to add on here, Christian, bro?
Oh yeah, quite a lot. You've detailed quite a lot eloquently, but I think the big thing that we should first touch on is the idea of acceptance, and that's why first and foremost business likes people coming in from the third and second world is because they just have a higher propensity to accept shitter pay and shitter working conditions. You know, what would you rather? You can get away with paying someone, a really, really low wage, or would you rather someone that demands more money? Obviously, as a company, you're going to just demand the person that's happy to put up with a minimum wage, sharing a flat with 5 other people, doing very menial work in poor conditions, because there's little acceptance. I mean, it goes further as well. I mean, what was one of the biggest, and traditionally the biggest opposition that we have to exploitation of workers? Unions. Now, unions are on the decline in Britain, and that's partly because of the demographics of Britain. It's far easier, and anyone watching this will kind of know from lived experience, to bond, create more team links with people that are like you more similarly, speak the same languages as you, have the same kind of ideals. If you have a workforce comprised of people from all around the world, well, A, they're just not going to click together, and so they're not going to unionize as much. They're going to happily just get on with it. And then again, if you're importing more people, well, those that do disrupt, do protest, boom, we got 10 replacements lining up at the door to replace you with. Now, there's other two things I want to cover now as well, which are the two common leftist, advocacy points that they make for immigration. The classic ones that you'll hear people say. The first one is immigration creates growth. Now, if you're a viewer of this channel, you're obviously quite a smart person, so I'm sure you kind of get the economic logic of why growth isn't actually necessarily as beneficial to you as the headline figure says. But we'll go into it quickly here anyway. When people talk about growth, they're talking about GDP per capita growth. Now, GDP per capita growth is not a measure of your wealth. It doesn't really matter necessarily what the GDP per capita growth rate is for us. What it matters is for companies. That is because GDP per capita is not a measurement of personal wealth, it's a measurement of payments going in place. Now, if you're a business, do you want more and more people coming into your country, spending money on KFC and consuming? That's what you want. It doesn't matter about the savings people have, about our actual wage increasing, because for them, it's all about just what is being consumed. More people, more consumption. The other one, the classic lefty critique, is that immigration, it's a distraction to do away from their kind of evil wrongdoings. You always hear it like, once the billionaires escape not getting taxed, you're out there blaming the poor migrant that's come here just for a better life. But all that critique obviously fails, and as we've outlined in this video, is that migrant's there because of that billionaire. Your anger almost should be towards that billionaire. The left are right in that respect, but it's not for the reasons they outline. It's because that billionaire has also brought in that migrant too.
Amazing points, Christian, bro. The last thing I wanted to mention is primarily around the rhetoric of immigration itself. Because I mentioned this thing called a wealth pump earlier. And what ends up happening is that the more immigrants you have, the lower the median wage ends up being for the local person. The lower their median wage, the less happy they are in general. Why? Because, well, they can't access a house. They can't access the job market as much as they want to. They can't fulfill their desires. And most importantly, they're not better off than their parents or grandparents, which primarily is who we compare ourselves to. If we want to have a good aspect of, okay, how do I measure my well-being? You'd always look at your parents. The reason people in the 50s and 60s were incredibly happy is because their parents had to deal with the Great Depression. and they can see now that they're way better off. And so when you end up understanding that, okay, I'm not better off, in the meantime, you have these elites that get a wealth pump. Well, what happens when you have more and more and more and more and more billionaires? Well, not all of them are going to have the same agenda, and not all of them are going to be aligned with what they want. Of course, they're all going to be profit-driven if they're entrepreneurial elites, if they're economic elites. However, when it comes to other issues, again, it's also a zero-sum game. So when you have this overcrowding of elites, if you will, this overburdening in the system of elites, but you also have a population, a grassroots population who's incredibly unhappy, you have a country that is on the brisk of some kind of conflict. Now, I'm not talking about a civil war. I don't want to talk about the civil war narrative at all, because I think for the most part, it's a psyop. But it doesn't lead to financial stability in the long term. And so the rhetoric I want to hold here that I think is the most sensible is, in the long term, this quote-unquote wealth pump doesn't benefit the elites, because all they're having is popular immiseration. That's it, immiseration, becoming miserable. And what that happens is people tend to be less optimistic. When people are less optimistic, we can see sociologically, they tend to want to work less. They tend to spend less money. And so this constant growth that the elites are looking for is going to be their downfall. And if we have to look at it from a left and right perspective, we need to understand that the left and the right, like Christian Bro said, they both have meaningful conversations to have with each other to understand that they're actually kind of both right. They both have a point. And it is the billionaires that are to blame. But it's also the billionaires that need to be held accountable, because they're the ones that are creating this entire thing. But that doesn't mean we excuse the immigrants and let them get away with any sort of criminal activity that we do. So the social aspect still remains important. But if we can come in the middle and discuss the importance and who we should be holding accountable, who are these non-political economic elites, then we can generally come down to solving immigration in the long term and economically benefiting the local population of any Western country. So that's my final point. Anything you wanted to add, Christian Bro?
Yep. That's a good point, and I'll just carry on slightly from what you've made. In that, look, if we do want to solve the immigration crisis in this country, it's going to take a monumental effort, and I think it requires more than the divide that's naturally emerged of pro-immigrant and anti-immigrant. We are going to have to get people that are kind of pro-immigrant on board, and instead of going for the kind of arguments that they are willingly not caring about, such as social change, such as demographic change, the best way now to approach the left, or the pro-immigrant side, we should call them, is to branch it economically. At the end of the day, that is a far more appealing argument and a better argument to get people on board with turning this country's policy on immigration against it. So I'd say that, yeah. Next time you're talking with, I'm sure if you're watching this, you talk about this with kind of more normie people, branch economically. Expose to them that actually this is a tool of capitalism, That's something they dislike, and now you can get them on board with it. But yeah, that's the kind of practical takeaway I'd say from this video.
Can we get your famous summary, Christian Bro?
Famous summary. But yeah. In summary, basically, immigration is of course, a negative social effect on the West. However, what is causing it is not some kind of nefarious scheme. What's causing it is the interests of the economic elite. And it's a continuous cycle of them wanting to suppress wages, increase consumption, whilst driving down the real wage of the native population. That is what has to be done. Take it forward in this way and always argue to the other people for immigration on these economic lines. It's a better and more effective argument.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much for watching. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Take care of yourselves. God bless. And we'll see you in the next video. Please subscribe. We'd love you for it.
Thank you very much.